Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Tuesday live stream at St. Raphael's. This is Father Kevin Ripley again. Glad to be joined by a couple of my colleagues here in church, in the audience today, so that's good. The topic is going to be the 5 arguments for the existence of God, presented by St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican friar in the 13th century and a proliferous writer. And he wrote basically a book of theology explaining different topics on theology called the Summa Theologica, the summary of theology, you could say. And it was composed of 1.8 million words, which would be about 3,000 double column full pages in our today's printing. And so just a huge volume. And within that, he had 3 different parts, and within the parts there were articles, and within the articles there were questions. And one of those questions is, does God exist? So I'm going to talk through his answer today to that question. But first, I'm going to read a passage from the book of Wisdom. This is Wisdom chapter 13, verses 1 through 9. Foolish by nature were all who were in ignorance of God, and who from the good things seen did not succeed in knowing the one who is, and from studying the works did not discern the artisan. Instead, either fire or wind or the swift air, or the circuit of the stars, or the mighty water, or the luminaries of heaven, the governors of the world, they considered to be gods. Now, if out of joy in their beauty they thought them gods, let them know how far more excellent is the Lord than these, for the original source of beauty fashioned them. Or if they were struck by their might and energy, let them realize from these things how much more powerful is the one who made them. For from the greatness and the beauty of created things, their original author, by analogy, is seen. But yet for these the blame is less, for they have gone astray perhaps, though they seek God and wish to find him. For they search busily among his works, but are distracted by what they see, because the things they see are fair. But again, not even these are pardonable. For if they so far succeeded in knowledge that they could speculate about the world, how did they not more quickly find its Lord? Again, Book of Wisdom, chapter 13, 1 through 9. Very, very interesting that even way back then, they're presenting, looking at things seen and making inferences about God as something humans can do. This is what Thomas basically did. So by way of example to start, just going to tell a little story. So this past last week, my dad and I had to burn some brush piles that we had collected over the year of preparing a little bit of an open field. And these brush piles are way back and kind of hidden from the view of the road. And my dad made sure to get a burning permit so that the fire department would know and could field any calls they might get from concerned residents of the area. Because you've driven down a road, you've probably had the experience where you see smoke off in the distance and might not be able to see where exactly it's coming from, but you make the inference from the smoke that there must be a fire. We can know at least there's that much we can say. When I was little, I would see the smoke, and I would be in the car with my parents and my brother, and I would be really concerned because I thought a house was burning down. And so I would tell my parents we should call 911. And the thing is, my parents knew that was probably a mistaken thought, that from their experience, they knew that people just burn stuff. So the idea is we see something, we know what causes it. Now, This is kind of what Thomas does with the question of does God exist? He looks at what we can see in the world. We can infer that something is responsible for it, and we can go even to the very order and existence of the world with that question. So Thomas, when he answers these questions in his Summa, he first lists the best objections at the time, and then he says to the contrary, and he says some big statement, and then he gives his answer, and then he answers the objections. He gives some theology, and then he answers the objections. So in the question of does God exist, this is part 1 of the Summa Theologica. I put a link in the comments of the Facebook post on our website, on our Facebook. If you want to open that up at home, feel free to do so. But it's Article 1, I believe, question 2 of part 1, Article 3, question 2. There it is. Thomas presents objection number 1 to the question, does God exist? Objection is, it seems that God does not exist. Because if something is infinite, the contrary to what that thing is could not exist, and therefore neither could exist. The objection is that if God means he is infinite goodness, then he could not exist because there would be no evil discoverable in the world. Yet we do see evil in the world. Therefore, since evil exists, God could not exist. That's objection number 1. The question of evil in the world. Very good objection. Objection 2 is the following. Basically, objection 2 says that it seems that everything we see in the world can already be accounted for by principles, supposing that God did not exist. All natural things can be reduced to the principle of nature. On the contrary, and then all voluntary things. So this objection is making a distinction between natural things, which maybe we could say is kind of randomness, things that just naturally exist and there's no reason for them. And then voluntary things which happen because someone chooses. And then voluntary things can all be reduced to the one principle, which is human reason or will. Therefore, there's no need to suppose God's existence. Another decent objection. So to that, Thomas Aquinas says, on the contrary, it is said that the person of God in Exodus chapter 3:14 simply, I am who am, referencing when Moses asks God his name in the story of the burning bush. God says his name, I am who am. Thomas is pointing to this idea in philosophy that God is pure act. God is existence, pure being. So I am who am. God is existence itself. So with the bit of theology that Thomas presents in the middle of his discussion on this question, this is where he presents the 5 ways to argue for God's existence. He says, I answer that the existence of God can be argued for in 5 ways. The first way is the argument from motion. From motion. Motion could be taken either as something moving, energy that's happening, right? Molecules moving around, or even change. The word motion can mean, in this sense, change, referring to nature, which is changing. So the first step in this argument from motion is that, 1, our senses prove to us that some things are in motion. some things are changing. Right? We see things move around all the time. My hand is moving up and down right now. Secondly, things move or change when things that are able to move then start moving. Okay? So this is philosophy, this is logic. He's working logically through the question in these arguments. So we know things are moving. Things move when they start to move. Third, only something that's actually moving can make something else move. All right. Something that's actually moving makes something else move. They don't move by themselves. So that's the next point. Nothing makes itself move, right? Nothing can move itself. Following this argument would require us to conclude that, therefore, each thing in motion is moved by something else. Right? So kind of going back to that idea again, but there's logic in this argument. So if there's a series of things in motion, he's saying, then the next point to say is that this series could not extend back forever in infinity. We're dealing with what we're experiencing. We're dealing with actual perception in the world of things that exist materially, okay? And that can mean, right here and right now, that can mean far back in the universe, that can mean multiverse, or even further back. But this sequence of motion and change cannot go back infinitely, because if that were the case, there would be nothing moving right now. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover, put in motion by no other. And this everyone understands to be God. God who is unchanging. So that's the first argument from Thomas Aquinas. It's just a very simple analogy, often uses the image of a train. Okay, so you got a train, one locomotive is pulling all of the rest, or maybe a caboose pushing all the rest, right? There's an engine that's pushing or pulling. If you start at the boxcar, and if you say this boxcar is moving, and you go all the way back, you're going to find the locomotive. If we try to say that, no, you can go back infinitely and never reach the locomotive, then the boxcar would not be moving. Okay. So that's the argument for motion. Why is something moving rather than not moving? All right, the second argument, the second way, is the argument from efficient cause, the argument from cause. So efficient cause, or causes, mean that things that we perceive in the world are caused to exist. They don't just, they need an explanation. And we see the microphone here, the ambo. You look at it and we think, oh, was somebody had to cut the pieces of wood, and then you think, well, where did the wood come from? Well, it grew in the woods, so someone had to cut the wood down, and maybe they were planted by the wind, the seeds that fell, and you could go on and on and on. Well, where did this come from? Where did that come from? Where did that come from? Our experience tells us that things are caused. And then Thomas says that nothing that we perceive exists prior to itself. So this ambo did not exist before it was made, okay? Before it was put together, however you want to say it. Therefore, nothing in the world of things we perceive is the cause of itself. So if nothing exists prior to itself, then nothing that we see that exists before it existed. And Thomas says, if something that caused it did not exist, neither would the result or the effect exist. So he's now saying that, okay, if it doesn't cause itself, then something must have caused it. And if the something that caused it, we could say the craftsperson of the ambo, if that craftsperson didn't exist, the ambo would not exist. And then if you take this in a series, right, going back and back and back, and if you find the first thing in that line, the very first thing, we keep asking the question, well, where did that come from? Where did that come from? If that first thing didn't exist in the series, then neither would the present thing. Therefore, if there was an infinite series, if we said, well, that series should be able to go back forever, well, then nothing would exist right now, because there would never be a start. Well, that conclusion that nothing exists right now is plainly false, because we see things that are existing. Therefore, Thomas says, those causes don't extend infinitely into the past. Therefore, it's necessary to admit a first cause to which everyone gives the name God. Now, the objection to that a modern day objection might be, and I've had kids ask me this in school, well, if everything needs a cause, then what caused God? Very good question. Well, the thing is, this argument didn't say that everything needs a cause. It says that whatever begins to exist requires a cause. Did God begin to exist? If he didn't begin to exist, then he wouldn't require a cause. So no philosopher that's competent in philosophy, I guess, would ever say that everything needs a cause, but rather everything that begins to exist requires a cause. In our experience, we see this. Another thing with that question of, well, what caused God, is that the idea, the very intuition behind the question actually supports the existence of God as the ultimate cause of things. Because when you ask, well, what caused that, you must naturally progress up the causal chain, right? That progression, that series. You have to progress down that series until there are only two options left. Either that the chain is infinitely long, or that it terminates with a final uncaused cause. There's got to be an uncaused cause. All right, that was the second argument. The third argument, the third way, talking 5 ways, is the argument from possibility. The argument from possibility and necessity. So this argument is pretty interesting. So Thomas starts by looking at saying that we find in nature, as we look around us, we find that there are some things that are possible to be and some things not to be. Meaning they don't have to exist, right? So this ambo, it didn't have to be, it didn't have to exist. A different one could have been used, or a different one could have been made. There are things that come into being and things that go out of being. All right, things that come into being and things that go out of being. We see this. We have even the wood, the tree that was my dad and I were burning, right? The wood came into existence and it was burned and then it left existence. All right? So we see this. Now, the name, the philosophical word for these things that don't have to exist, which is pretty much everything, is contingent being. Contingent, meaning they rely on something else for their being. All right. And so for each contingent being, right, for each thing that doesn't have to exist, then there is a time that it does not exist. Okay? So this ambo is not an eternal thing. Right? It doesn't exist forever. And at one point it didn't exist. And you can say that for everything. Therefore, it is impossible for these things to always have existed if there was a time that they did not exist. Therefore, there could have been a time when no things existed. Now, Aquinas is taking this to the extreme, to the universe, to all of material reality. If each and everything, it's possible that they didn't have to exist, well, there could have been a time when no things existed. And if there was a time when no things existed, at that time, there would have been nothing to bring the currently existing contingent beings into existence. All right. So if nothing, and I mean, when we talk about nothing, I mean, we were talking about nothing, no thing, all right? So that would include, or disclude a vacuum, right? Like a space vacuum, that would be something, all right? Or disclude multiverse, or, I mean, we're going way, way back, before time, right? So there had to be no thing. If that's the case, then nothing would be available to make something. And if that was the case, then there would be nothing in existence now. Yet, Thomas says, now we've reached an absurd result by assuming that every being is a contingent being. You know, we assumed that everything once didn't exist, or doesn't have to exist. And by doing that, we've reached an absurd result by concluding that nothing should exist right now. Because we see, we're here, things do exist. Thomas's conclusion then is, therefore, not every being is a contingent being. Right? Not every being requires, not every being didn't have to exist. Therefore, some being exists of its own necessity and does not receive its existence from another being, but rather causes them. This all people speak of as God. That's Thomas's third way. The fourth one's pretty short. The fourth way is the argument from gradation of being. So Thomas says we look at the things around us, or even in the qualities of persons, and we see that there's a gradation, meaning there's certain kind of levels of quality in things. We were selling Christmas trees here at St. Raphael's in December, and I saw people going through, looking at the different trees and kind of picking out the best tree. There's different levels of what makes a Christmas tree. You know, some people maybe have different ideas of what that might mean, but there's this idea people have of the perfect Christmas tree. So they're looking for the best one they could find. Or you can think of a circle, right? If I draw a circle in kindergarten, it's not going to look too good. If I draw a circle in 8th grade, it's looking a little better, right? Drawing a circle in senior year high school art class, probably going to look pretty good. Now, if I have a math class, I'll bring out my protractor and draw a circle. It's going to be pretty perfect. So there's a gradation how good a circle could be. There's different levels of goodness we see in the world, right? Of how good things are, how good people are, or how loving people are, or how hot something is. These are gradations of being. Some are better or worse than others. Now, the idea of there being this gradation of degrees and things require some reference point, Thomas says, for the uttermost case, like I said, the perfect Christmas tree, or the hottest thing, right? You'd probably say the hottest thing is like the sun, or the center of the earth. I don't know. It was 13th century, so science wasn't as developed back then. And he says that the maximum in any category is the cause of the rest. So in talking about goodness, the maximum goodness must be the cause of all other goodness, or the maximum heat must be the cause of all other heat. Again, science, Thomas might be lacking in this argument. However, his final point in this way is that, therefore, there must also be something which is, to all beings, the cause of their being. goodness, and every other perfection. And this we call God. So we say things, God is perfect goodness, God is love, right? God is truth. So God would be cause of all truth. Anything I learned in school ultimately comes from God. I mean, any love that I expend to another ultimately comes from God. That's the fourth way. And then the fifth way, the last way, is the argument from design, or there's a fancy word called teleology, talking about what things are meant for. So Thomas says that we see that when we look around us, natural bodies, natural things, especially things that are alive, work toward some goal. And they do not do so by chance. So that could be a whole nother discussion right at that point. They do not do so by chance. So you think about the caterpillar, right? Building its cocoon. Think about the squirrels collecting their acorns. The animals and beings, they seem to know what to do. The tree growing towards the sun, they seem to do something, right? There's a purpose. The tree makes oxygen in the world, all these things, right? There's some goal that natural bodies work toward. And he said most natural things lack knowledge. They lack knowledge. Most natural things lack knowledge. But Thomas says, just as an arrow reaches its target because it's directed by an archer, those things which lack intelligence achieve goals by being directed by something intelligent. Basically, something that created them or made them. But he's really focusing on that whole idea of things do things, and they have specific goals, and who gave them that goal? How did they get that? Is it all just random chance? That could be the whole other discussion. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. So we have the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas. I encourage you to look them up and read them in their fullness. They're not that long. Or maybe watch a YouTube video, Google Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways. But just real briefly, remember those first objections, the one about, well, God couldn't exist if there's evil. Then 2, God couldn't exist since everything has natural explanation. Well, his reply to objection about the evil says that, well, God, since he's the highest good, would not allow any evil to exist unless his power and goodness were such as to bring good, even out of evil. He says this is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and out of it produce good. So it's not in competition with God's goodness, but because of his goodness. And then secondly, about is everything reduced just to natural explanation? Well, his point is that we just argued many different cases that there must be a first cause, even in nature. And that even that things that are done from the will must be traced back to some higher cause, since these can all fail. Voluntary things can fail. So there must be something that's not changeable and unfailing, and that would be God. So thank you for entertaining these thoughts today. Hopefully that made a little bit of sense. And again, I encourage you to keep looking into it and checking out what Thomas had to say, and even maybe look at some later thoughts on that. So may God bless you all. Have a wonderful rest of your